Sometimes, when you've lost everything, the only direction left is forward. When you're down to your last dollar and your children are watching you fall apart, you'll grab onto anything that looks like hope. Ben Grady found his hope in Baltimore Harbor. A rusted cargo ship called the Avalon Dawn sat abandoned for 3 years. Nobody wanted her. She was free to anyone who could tow her away. Ben used his last $300 to claim her. He thought he was buying scrap metal. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. But when Ben and his kids started clearing out the rust and debris, they found something nobody expected: hidden walls, secret compartments, and behind them, a Cold War treasure worth $200 million. The ship had been carrying more than cargo on her final voyage 40 years ago. But what happens when powerful people realize their lost fortune has finally been found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ben Grady's fingers found the familiar weight of Sarah's wedding ring in his pocket as he stared at the stack of rejection letters on his kitchen table. 3 months since his last construction job. 18 months since Sarah lost her battle with cancer. The ring had become his anchor, something solid to hold when everything else felt like it was slipping away. "Dad, there's no milk for cereal." Emma's voice carried the careful tone she'd adopted since her mother died, too mature for 12, too worried about adding to his burden. "I'll get some today, sweetheart." The lie came easier now. He'd mastered the art of sounding confident while his world crumbled. The refrigerator hummed its empty song, and the bills on the counter seemed to multiply when he wasn't looking. Jake appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas, hair sticking up in directions that defied physics. At 8, he hadn't learned to hide his disappointment yet. "You said that yesterday." Ben pulled both children close, breathing in the scent of their shampoo, the generic brand from the dollar store. But it still smelled like home. "How about we make it an adventure? We'll walk to Mrs. Chen's corner store, and maybe she'll let you pick out something special." Emma met his eyes over Jake's head. She knew they couldn't afford anything special, but she nodded anyway. His daughter had become his partner in this delicate dance of maintaining hope while reality pressed against their windows like a storm. The apartment felt smaller every day: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that belonged in a dollhouse. When Sarah was alive, they'd made it work. Her laughter had filled the corners, her cooking had made the small space feel abundant. Now the walls seemed to lean inward, reminding him of everything he couldn't provide. Ben had built houses for other families for 15 years, houses with backyards and guest rooms and pantries full of food. He'd taken pride in creating spaces where people could build their dreams. Now he couldn't even keep the lights on in this cramped apartment. The construction business had collapsed like a house of cards when Sarah got sick. He'd turned down jobs to be with her during treatments, spent their savings on experimental therapies insurance wouldn't cover. When she died, the clients had moved on to other contractors, and the economy had shifted. Nobody wanted to hire a middle-aged carpenter whose hands shook when he thought too hard about the future. Mrs. Chen greeted them with the warmth she reserved for people who needed it most. Her corner store was a refuge in their neighborhood of struggling families and forgotten dreams. She always managed to find reasons to give the children small gifts: a piece of candy that was about to expire, a comic book someone had returned. "Mr. Ben, you look tired." Her observation came wrapped in concern, not judgment. "Just thinking too much, Mrs. Chen." He watched Jake examine the candy selection with the serious consideration of a sommelier choosing wine. Thinking never put food on table, doing puts food on table. She handed Emma a carton of milk without waiting for payment. "You pay me when you can. No hurry." The kindness nearly broke him. He'd grown up believing that men provided for their families, that fathers were supposed to be rocks their children could depend on. Now he was accepting charity from a 70-year-old woman who worked 16-hour days in a store that barely stayed afloat. Walking home, Jake's hand in his, Emma carrying the milk like a precious gift, Ben felt the weight of their trust. They believed in him completely, absolutely, without question. They looked at him and saw strength, competence, safety. The responsibility was crushing and motivating in equal measure. Back in the apartment, Ben spread the morning newspaper across the table while the children ate their cereal. The job listings had become a daily ritual of disappointment, but he read them anyway. Construction worker needed must-have own tools. His tools had been sold 3 months ago. Experienced foreman references required. His references came from a business that no longer existed. Then he saw it. A small notice tucked between an ad for used furniture and a plea for aluminum can donations. Abandoned vessel, the Avalon Dawn, free to qualified applicant, willing to assume towing and disposal costs. Contact Harbor Authority. Ben read it 3 times. Ships weren't given away. There had to be a catch, some hidden cost that would surface once he made contact. But the word free pulled at something deep in his chest. Free meant possibility. Free meant a chance. What's that, Dad? Emma had inherited Sarah's ability to read his expressions. Maybe nothing, maybe something. He folded the paper, tucking the notice where he could find it later. Finish your breakfast. I need to make some phone calls. The Harbor Authority office smelled like diesel fuel and disappointment. The clerk, a weathered man named Rodriguez, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, barely looked up when Ben approached the counter. I'm here about the ship, the Avalon Dawn. Rodriguez's head snapped up. You're the first person to ask about her in 6 months. You know what you're getting into? Tell me. She's been sitting in slip 47 for 3 years. Previous owner died. No next of kin. No one wants to pay for disposal. She's yours if you can prove you've got the means to tow her and either scrap her or make her seaworthy. Rodriguez slid a form across the counter. Filing fee is $300. Ben's heart sank. $300 might as well have been $3,000. It was every penny he had left, the money he'd been saving for next month's rent. Can I see her first? Rodriguez shrugged. Slip 47, don't fall in the water. City won't pay to fish you out. The walk to the harbor took 20 minutes. Ben's neighborhood gave way to industrial buildings and empty lots, places where Baltimore showed its rust and abandonment. The harbor itself stretched out like a graveyard of maritime dreams. Some slips held working vessels, fishing boats, small cargo haulers, the occasional pleasure craft. Others contained forgotten hulks that would never sail again. Slip 47 sat at the far end, where the harbor curved away from the main shipping channels. Ben saw her before he saw the number. The Avalon Dawn rose from the water like a ghost ship, her hull streaked with rust and neglect. She was bigger than he'd expected, maybe 300 feet long, with a superstructure that spoke of better days. Her paint had long since surrendered to the elements, leaving her the color of old blood and deeper wounds. But Ben didn't see decay. He saw possibility. He saw a hull that was still sound, judging by how she sat in the water. He saw space, more space than he'd had in years. He saw something he could work with, something he could transform. Most importantly, he saw hope, wearing a coat of rust. Sarah's ring pressed against his fingers as he stood on the dock, studying the ship. She would have understood. Sarah had always seen potential where others saw problems. She'd seen it in him when he was just another carpenter with big dreams and empty pockets. What do you think, Sarah? He whispered to the wind. The answer came not in words but in feeling, a certainty that settled in his chest like warm tea on a cold morning. This was right. This was the path forward. Ben walked back to the Harbor Authority office with the steady stride of a man who'd made a decision. He placed 3 crumpled hundreds on Rodriguez's counter grocery money. Light bill money, hope money. I'll take her. Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment. You sure about this? She's been sitting there for 3 years. Could be anything wrong with her. I'm sure. The paperwork took an hour. Forms and signatures and warnings about liability and environmental hazards. When it was finished, Rodriguez handed him a set of keys that looked older than Jake. Congratulations, Mr. Grady. You're now the proud owner of the most expensive pile of scrap metal in Baltimore Harbor. Ben pocketed the keys next to Sarah's ring. We'll see about that. Walking home, he felt lighter than he had in months. Emma and Jake would be excited. They loved adventures, even if this one came wrapped in rust and uncertainty. Tomorrow, they'd go see their ship. Tomorrow, they'd start building something new from something everyone else had given up on. Sometimes the most broken things carried the greatest treasures. He was about to find out just how true that could be. The morning sun cast long shadows across Baltimore Harbor as Ben led Emma and Jake down the weathered dock towards Slip 47. The children's excitement was infectious. They chattered about pirates and treasure maps and living on a boat like characters in their adventure books. "There she is," Ben said, stopping at the edge of the pier. The Avalon Dawn looked even more imposing in daylight. Her rust-streaked hull rose nearly 3 stories above the waterline, and her superstructure stretched back like a small city of metal and memories. Emma whistled low, a habit she'd picked up from her mother. "She's huge," Jake breathed, his 8-year-old imagination already transforming the derelict vessel into something magnificent. Ben studied the ship with a contractor's eye. The hull showed surface rust, but no obvious holes or structural damage. The deck was littered with debris and puddles of rainwater, but the bones underneath looked solid. Most importantly, she was floating level, which meant the engine room wasn't flooded. "Can we go aboard?" Emma asked, already calculating the best route up the gangway. "Carefully, and we stay together." The gangway creaked under their weight but held firm. Ben tested each step before allowing the children to follow. The deck stretched out before them like a football field made of metal, dotted with cargo hatches and mysterious equipment covered in rust and bird droppings. Jake ran toward the superstructure, his footsteps echoing off the metal decking. "Dad, there's a ladder here. Can I climb it?" "After we check out the main deck." Ben wanted to establish their bearings before they started exploring. The ship was a maze of passages and compartments, easy to get lost in. They made their way toward the bridge, the highest structure on the ship. The wheelhouse windows were filmed with salt and grime, but through them, Ben could see the remains of navigation equipment and charts still pinned to plotting tables. "Look at all the buttons," Emma marveled, peering through a broken window. Inside the bridge, time seemed frozen in 1983. Charts showed shipping lanes along the eastern seaboard, and a coffee cup sat on the captain's console as if its owner had just stepped away for a moment. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. Ben found the ship's documentation in a metal filing cabinet behind the captain's chair. Most of the papers were water-damaged and illegible, but one folder remained sealed in plastic. Inside, he found the ship's original manifest from her final voyage. The manifest was dated October 15, 1983, listing cargo bound for Norfolk, Virginia, standard freight machinery parts, textiles, canned goods. But something about it nagged at Ben. The handwriting was different in several places, as if entries had been made by different people at different times. "Dad, come look at this," Emma called from the chart table. She'd found a navigation chart with the ship's final route marked in red ink. The line showed a departure from Baltimore, but instead of heading directly to Norfolk, as the manifest indicated, the route curved northeast toward the Chesapeake Bay Islands. "That's weird," Jake observed, tracing the route with his finger. "Why would they go that way?" Ben compared the chart to the manifest. The dates matched, but the destinations didn't. Ships didn't typically make detours on cargo runs unless there was an emergency or special circumstances. "Maybe they had to avoid bad weather," Emma suggested, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it either. They spent the next hour exploring the ship's main deck and upper levels. The Avalon Dawn was larger and more complex than Ben had initially thought. Beyond the standard cargo holds, they found specialized compartments with reinforced doors and unusual ventilation systems. Some areas were sealed off entirely, their entrances welded shut decades ago. In the ship's library, a small room behind the mess hall, Jake discovered something that made Ben's pulse quicken. A ship's roster from 1,983 listed 37 crew members for what should have been a routine cargo run. Ben had worked around ships enough to know that was double the normal complement. Why would they need so many people just to carry cargo? Emma asked, reading over his shoulder. Ben didn't have an answer, but the pieces of a puzzle were starting to form in his mind. The unusual route, the oversized crew, the sealed compartments, none of it fit with a standard commercial voyage. They made their way below deck, where the ship's true size became apparent. Corridor after corridor stretched into darkness, lined with doors leading to crew quarters, storage rooms, and machinery spaces. The air smelled of rust and diesel fuel, and something else, something that reminded Ben of old secrets. In the crew's mess hall, they found evidence that people had left in a hurry. Plates and cups sat on tables, as if a meal had been interrupted. Personal items, a deck of cards, a paperback novel, a coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" printed on the side, remained where their owners had left them 40 years ago. "It's like everyone just disappeared," Jake whispered, his voice echoing in the empty space. Ben was beginning to think that might be exactly what happened. They were heading back toward the main deck when Emma noticed something odd about one of the corridor walls. The paint was a slightly different shade, and when she pressed against it, it gave slightly under pressure. "Dad, I think this is fake." Ben examined the wall more closely. The metal paneling was definitely newer than the surrounding structure, and it had been painted to match but not quite perfectly. More telling, it was held in place with screws rather than welded seams. "Stand back," he told the children. Using a multi-tool from his pocket, Ben removed the screws holding the panel in place. It came away easily, revealing a narrow space behind the false wall. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather-bound logbook. The cover was embossed with gold lettering, Captain's Personal Log, E.J. Morrison, Master. Ben opened it carefully, mindful that the pages might be fragile after 40 years. The entries were written in a careful hand, starting with routine navigation notes and weather observations. But as Ben read further, the tone changed. References to special cargo and classified protocols appeared with increasing frequency. One entry, dated October 10, 1983, made Ben's hands shake. Received sealed orders from Norfolk Station. Previous manifest superseded. New cargo requires Level 7 security protocols. Crew briefed on need-to-know basis only. God help us all if this goes wrong. Ben looked up to find Emma and Jake watching him intently. The excitement in their eyes had been replaced by something more serious, the recognition that they'd stumbled onto something bigger than a simple abandoned ship. "What does it say?" Emma asked quietly. Ben closed the logbook, his mind racing. The Avalon Dawn wasn't just an old cargo ship. She was something else entirely, something that had been carrying secrets along with her manifest cargo. And those secrets had been important enough to justify unusual routes, oversized crews, and sealed orders. "I think," Ben said slowly, "we need to learn a lot more about this ship before we go any further." As they made their way back to the main deck, Ben noticed something he'd missed on their arrival. A sedan with tinted windows sat in the harbor parking lot, positioned where its occupants could observe the Avalon Dawn. When Ben looked directly at it, the car's engine started, and it pulled away. Someone else was interested in their ship, someone who might not appreciate Ben and his children poking around in 40-year-old secrets. But as Ben helped Emma and Jake down the gangway, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the thrill of discovery. The Avalon Dawn was more than just a chance at a fresh start. She was a mystery waiting to be solved, and Ben Grady had always been good at solving puzzles. The question was whether he'd be able to solve this one before it solved him. Ben spent that evening reading Captain Morrison's log by lamplight, while Emma and Jake slept. The entries painted a picture of a man caught between duty and conscience, carrying cargo he wasn't supposed to understand, but clearly did. October 12, 1000. 983. The passenger came aboard at 300 hours, diplomatic passport, but his hands shake like a man who's seen too much. Whatever he's carrying in those sealed cases, it's worth more than my ship and crew combined. October 13, 1983. Changed course per sealed orders. We're not going to Norfolk anymore. New destination classified, but I've been sailing these waters for 20 years. We're heading for the deep channels near Tangier Island. October 14, 1983. Passenger spent all day in his cabin with those cases. I can hear him talking, sounds like he's recording something. The crew is getting nervous. So am I. The final entry was dated October 15, 1983, the day the ship was supposed to arrive in Norfolk, according to the original manifest. October 15, 1983. Everything's gone wrong. Radio intercepts suggest we're being followed. Passenger insists on implementing contingency protocols. I've sealed the special cargo per his instructions. If something happens to us, maybe someone will find this record and understand we were just following orders. The passenger's name is Kozlov. God, have mercy on us all. Ben closed the log and rubbed his tired eyes. Dmitry Kozlov, the name meant nothing to him, but it had clearly meant everything to Captain Morrison. A diplomatic passenger with sealed cases and contingency protocols, a ship that changed course to avoid someone or something, and cargo that had been sealed away so thoroughly that 40 years later it remained hidden. The next morning, Ben took the logbook to the Enoch Pratt Free Library in downtown Baltimore. If he was going to understand what they'd found, he needed research help. The librarian at the reference desk was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her nameplate read, Ruth Martinez. I'm trying to research a ship, Ben explained, placing the logbook carefully on her desk. She was active in 1983, but I think there might be more to her story than the official records show. Ruth examined the logbook with the reverence of someone who understood the value of primary sources. This is authentic, 1980s materials. Where did you find it? On the ship. I recently acquired the Avalon Dawn. Ruth's eyebrows rose. You're the one who claimed her? I heard someone finally took that old ghost. You know about the ship. I've lived in Baltimore all my life. The harbor doesn't keep many secrets from people who pay attention. Ruth opened the logbook to the first page. What exactly are you hoping to find? Ben told her about the inconsistencies in the manifest, the unusual crew size, and the mysterious passenger named Kozlov. Ruth listened with the focused attention of a professional researcher. Let me see what I can dig up. Cold War-era shipping records can be tricky. A lot of information was classified or deliberately obscured. She led him to a computer terminal. But sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing. While Ruth worked her digital magic, Ben found himself in the children's section, where Emma and Jake were supposed to be reading quietly. Instead, they'd found a book about famous shipwrecks and were comparing them to their own vessel. Dad, look at this one, Jake said, pointing to a picture of a ship covered in rust. It looks just like ours, but they found treasure on it. Maybe we'll find treasure too, Emma added, but her tone was more thoughtful than excited. At 12, she was old enough to understand that real life rarely matched storybook adventures. Ruth called Ben back to the reference desk an hour later. She'd assembled a small stack of printed articles and photocopied documents. Your Dmitry Kozlov was quite the interesting character, she said, spreading the papers across the desk. Soviet diplomat, posted to the embassy in Washington from 1981 to 1983. According to State Department records, he requested asylum in October 1983. Ben felt a chill run down his spine. Asylum? It gets more interesting. 3 days after his asylum request, there was a security incident at the Soviet embassy. Someone had removed classified materials. Kozlov disappeared the same night. Ruth showed him a newspaper clipping from the Washington Post, dated October 16, 1983. The headline read, "Soviet diplomat missing after embassy break-in." The article says Kozlov was believed to be defecting, but he never made it to his scheduled meeting with CIA handlers. He simply vanished. Ruth pointed to a sidebar story. There was also a report of an abandoned ship found drifting in Chesapeake Bay around the same time, but the connection was never made public. Ben's hands were trembling as he read the article. The timeline matched Captain Morrison's log entries perfectly. Kozlov had boarded the Avalon Dawn on October 12, and by October 16, both he and the ship had disappeared from official records. "What happened to the ship?" Ben asked. According to maritime records, she was found by the Coast Guard and towed to Baltimore Harbor. The official report listed her as abandoned with no crew aboard. She was eventually sold for scrap, but... Ruth paused, checking another document. But there's no record of her actually being scrapped. She just sat in various slips for 40 years, until you claimed her. And Kozlov? Never found, presumed dead, though his body was never recovered. Ruth gathered the papers into a neat stack. "Mr. Grady, if what you found is authentic, you may be holding the key to a 40-year-old mystery." Ben thought about the sealed compartments they'd discovered, the false walls, and the sense that the ship was holding on to secrets. What kind of classified materials would a Soviet diplomat have access to? In 1983, could be anything. Military secrets, intelligence networks, strategic plans. Ruth's expression grew serious. The kind of information people kill for. They were interrupted by the sound of chairs scraping as Emma and Jake approached the desk. Both children looked subdued. The weight of adult conversations had a way of penetrating even the most focused reading. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" Jake asked quietly. Ben pulled his son close. "No, buddy. We're just learning about our ship's history." "Is it a bad history?" Emma's question carried the weight of someone who'd already lost too much to life's unexpected turns. Ben looked at Ruth, who gave him an encouraging nod. "It's a complicated history, but that doesn't make it bad. Sometimes the most interesting stories are the complicated ones." As they prepared to leave the library, Ruth handed Ben a business card. "If you need help researching further, please call me. This is the kind of historical puzzle that doesn't come along often." Walking back to the harbor with the children, Ben felt the weight of revelation settling on his shoulders. The Avalon Dawn wasn't just an abandoned ship, she was a floating tomb of Cold War secrets. And somewhere in her sealed compartments, she might still be carrying whatever Dmitry Kozlov had died protecting. But as they approached Slip 47, Ben noticed the same sedan from yesterday parked in a different spot. This time, when he looked directly at it, the driver didn't leave. Instead, the window rolled down slightly, and Ben caught a glimpse of sunglasses and a camera lens. Someone was definitely watching them, someone who knew exactly what the Avalon Dawn represented. Ben quickened his pace, ushering Emma and Jake toward the ship. Whatever secrets the vessel was carrying, they were valuable enough to attract attention after 40 years. And that meant Ben and his children were no longer just treasure hunters, they were potential targets. As they boarded the ship, Ben made a mental note to start carrying his old construction tools again. If they were going to continue exploring the Avalon Dawn's mysteries, they needed to be prepared for more than just rust and old documents. They needed to be prepared for the possibility that some secrets were worth killing to protect. Ben was stripping old paint from the ship's galley when his scraper hit something that didn't belong. Instead of the hollow ring of metal against metal, he heard a dull thunk. Emma, who was sorting through salvageable hardware nearby, looked up at the sound. What was that? Ben ran his hands along the wall where he'd been working. The surface felt different here, slightly raised, as if something had been built into the structure. He called Jake over from where he was cataloging items they'd found. "Help me clear more paint from this section." Working together, they revealed the outline of a rectangular panel, carefully concealed but not permanently sealed. Unlike the false wall where they'd found the captain's log, this one was designed to be opened by someone who knew where to look. Ben found the mechanism by accident, a concealed latch disguised as a pipe fitting. When he pressed it, the panel swung inward with a soft click. Inside was a cavity just large enough to hold a small object wrapped in oiled leather. Ben unwrapped it carefully, revealing an ornate brass key unlike anything he'd seen before. It was heavier than a normal key, with intricate engravings along its shaft and a head shaped like a diplomatic seal. "What do you think it opens?" Emma asked, turning the key over in her hands. Before Ben could answer, they heard footsteps on the deck above. Heavy boots, moving with purpose rather than curiosity. Ben motioned for the children to stay quiet and slipped the key into his pocket. "Hello? Anyone aboard?" The voice carried authority and a slight accent Ben couldn't place. Ben climbed the stairs to the main deck, leaving Emma and Jake in the galley. A man in his 70s stood near the gangway, wearing a peacoat that had seen better decades. His white hair was still thick, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to command. "I'm Ben Grady. This is my ship now." The man smiled, extending a weathered hand. "Marcus Webb. I served on this vessel, back when she had a different name and a different purpose." Ben shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of a lifetime working with his hands. "Different name? She was the Meridian Star when I knew her. Navy auxiliary vessel, though that was never in the official records." Marcus looked around the deck with the familiarity of someone revisiting a childhood home. "I heard someone had finally claimed her. Figured I should introduce myself." Navy auxiliary? Ben thought about the classified cargo and the mysterious passenger. What kind of work did she do? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Ben's face. "The kind of work that officially never happened. You mind if I come aboard properly? There are things you should know about this ship." Ben led Marcus to the ship's bridge, where they could talk without the children overhearing. The older man moved through the corridors with the confidence of someone who knew every rivet and bulkhead. "I was a Navy diver," Marcus explained, settling into the captain's chair as if it were his own. "Specialized in underwater salvage and recovery. In 1983, I was attached to a joint CIA-Navy operation called Deep Current." What was Deep Current? Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, we provided transportation and security for high-value defectors and sensitive cargo. Marcus picked up one of the navigation charts, running his finger along the route marked in red ink. "The Meridian Star, your Avalon Dawn, was our primary asset." Ben felt the weight of the brass key in his pocket. "What happened in October 1983? Marcus's expression darkened. "We picked up a Soviet diplomat named Dmitry Kozlov. He was carrying intelligence that could have changed the balance of the Cold War if he'd lived long enough to deliver it. He died. The whole operation went sideways. Kozlov was supposed to be a simple extraction, but someone leaked the operation. We were intercepted by a Soviet submarine off Tangier Island." Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor. "Kozlov knew they'd caught up to us. He activated contingency protocols." "What kind of contingency protocols?" Marcus turned back to Ben. He sealed his intelligence package in the ship's secure vault. The idea was that even if they captured or killed him, the information would be safe until recovery teams could retrieve it. Ben's pulse quickened. "Where's this vault?" "That's the problem. Only Kozlov knew the exact location and access codes. When the Soviets boarded us, they killed most of the crew and took Kozlov, but they never found the vault." Marcus sat back down heavily. 40 years, I've wondered what happened to that intelligence package. The crew was killed? Ben thought about the personal items left behind in the mess hall, the sense of interrupted lives. "Not all of us. I was underwater when they attacked, checking the hull for damage. By the time I surfaced, it was over. The ship was drifting, The crew was gone, and Kozlov's intelligence had vanished with him. Ben pulled the brass key from his pocket. Marcus's eyes widened when he saw it. "Where did you find that?" "Hidden in the galley wall. Do you recognize it?" Marcus took the key with hands that trembled slightly. "Diplomatic pouch key. Kozlov never went anywhere without it." He looked up at Ben. "If you found this, it means he hid it before they took him. He wanted someone to find it." "What does it open?" "Kozlov's insurance policy. He told me once that he'd prepared for the possibility of betrayal. Said he'd hidden proof of his intelligence in a way that only he could access." Marcus held up the key. "This might be the key to that proof." Ben called for Emma and Jake to join them on the bridge. The children had been listening from the stairway anyway, and he'd learned that trying to shield them from difficult truths only made them more curious. "Mr. Webb was telling me about the ship's history," Ben explained as they settled around the chart table. Marcus smiled at the children. "Your father's found something very important. This ship is carrying secrets that powerful people have been searching for since before you were born." "Good secrets or bad secrets?" Jake asked with the directness of childhood. "Secrets that could help good people and hurt bad people," Marcus replied. "The man who hid them was trying to do the right thing, even though it cost him his life." Emma studied the brass key. "So we need to find what this opens." "We need to be very careful," Ben corrected. "If people have been looking for this for 40 years, they're not going to be happy that we found it." Marcus nodded gravely. "There are folks who've built careers on keeping certain Cold War secrets buried. If word gets out that Kozlov's intelligence package still exists..." "What kind of intelligence?" Ben asked. "Soviet spy networks, military plans, the locations of hidden assets. But more than that, Kozlov had evidence of American officials who were working for the Soviets. Names, dates, bank records." Marcus's voice dropped. "The kind of information that could destroy reputations and end careers, even 40 years later." Ben thought about the sedan that had been watching them, the sense of being observed. "How would anyone know we found anything? The intelligence community is smaller than you'd think, and they have long memories, if you've been asking questions about Kozlov and the ship." Marcus shrugged. "Word travels." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the harbor parking lot reached them through the bridge windows. Ben counted 4 black SUVs, positioning themselves where they could observe the ship. "Looks like word has traveled," Marcus said grimly. Ben gathered Emma and Jake close. The adventure they'd stumbled into was becoming more dangerous by the hour, and his children's safety had to come first. But as he looked at the brass key in Marcus's weathered hands, Ben realized they'd already crossed a line. They weren't just exploring an old ship anymore, they were the guardians of secrets that could reshape history. The question was whether they'd live long enough to decide what to do with them. The black SUVs maintained their vigil through the night. Ben had moved Emma and Jake to the ship's crew quarters, reasoning that if they were being watched, they might as well stay close to whatever secrets the Avalon Dawn was protecting. Marcus had volunteered to take the first watch, his Navy training still sharp, despite his 70-plus years. At dawn, Ben found Marcus in the radio room, hunched over a device that definitely hadn't been there the day before. It was compact and metallic, covered in dials and switches that belonged in a spy movie rather than an abandoned cargo ship. "Is that what I think it is?" Ben asked, recognizing the device from Marcus's description of Kozlov's equipment. "Encryption machine, Soviet era, but modified for NATO frequencies." Marcus looked up from the device with something approaching reverence. Kozlov was paranoid about communication security. "This beauty can decode just about anything from the early 1980s. "Where did you find it?" "Behind the radio console. There's a whole compartment back there, sealed with a combination lock." Marcus held up a piece of paper covered with numbers. "Took me 3 hours to crack it, but Kozlov was methodical. The combination was his daughter's birthday." Ben studied the encryption device. "His daughter's birthday? How do you know that?" Kozlov talked about her constantly during the voyage. Elena. She was 7 years old when he defected, living in Moscow with her grandmother. Marcus's expression softened. He carried her picture everywhere, talked about bringing her to America once his asylum was approved. What happened to her? I don't know. After the operation went bad, everyone involved was either killed or reassigned. The whole thing was classified so deep that most people convinced themselves it never happened. Emma and Jake appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of adult conversation and the mystery of new equipment. Jake immediately gravitated toward the encryption device, his 8-year-old fascination with buttons and switches in full display. "Can I touch it?" he asked. "Carefully," Marcus replied. "This machine holds the key to understanding everything Kozlov left behind." The device hummed to life when Marcus activated it. Numbers scrolled across a small display screen, and mechanical clicks filled the air as internal mechanisms aligned themselves. After several minutes, the machine settled into a steady rhythm. "It's searching for encrypted signals," Marcus explained. Kozlov programmed it to decode his personal communications protocols. Emma studied the paper with the combination numbers. If he used his daughter's birthday, maybe he used other personal information for other locks. "Smart girl," Marcus smiled. Kozlov was sentimental about family. His encryption keys were all tied to important dates and names. The machine suddenly stopped its searching pattern and emitted a sharp beep. Text began scrolling across the display, not in English, but in what looked like coordinates and technical specifications. "What's it saying?" Ben asked. Marcus frowned at the screen. "It's pulling encrypted data from somewhere on the ship. There must be a transmitter hidden in the hull that's been broadcasting this signal for 40 years. Broadcasting to who? Good question." Marcus adjusted several dials, and the signal became clearer. Kozlov set up multiple contingency plans. This might be one of them, a dead man's switch that activates if certain conditions are met. Ben thought about the brass key in his pocket. Like someone finding his personal effects? Exactly. The signal is giving us coordinates. Marcus pulled out a modern GPS device and entered the numbers. 38 degrees, 47 minutes north. 76 degrees, 12 minutes west. Where is that? Marcus showed him the GPS screen, about 15 miles southeast of here, in the deep water, off the continental shelf. Ben studied the coordinates. Why would Kozlov hide something underwater? "Insurance," Marcus replied. "If the ship's vault was compromised, he'd need a backup location that couldn't be searched or seized." Emma had been quietly examining the encryption device while the adults talked. Now she pointed to a secondary display that had activated. "There's more text coming through." New lines of code scrolled across the screen, but these were in English. Marcus read them aloud. "Package Alpha secured at designated coordinates. Access requires dual authorization ship's vault key plus personal authentication codes. Elena's future depends on proper retrieval. Trust no one in official channels. D.K." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Kozlov hadn't just hidden intelligence documents. He'd created an elaborate security system that required multiple keys and personal knowledge to access. "Personal authentication codes," Ben mused. "More family information? Probably. But after 40 years? Marcus shrugged. "Even if we figure out the codes, how do we retrieve something from the ocean floor?" "One problem at a time," Ben said. "First, we need to understand what we're looking for." They spent the morning exploring more of the ship's hidden compartments. Using the encryption device as a guide, they found 3 more concealed spaces, each containing pieces of Kozlov's elaborate puzzle. In the captain's quarters, behind a false bookshelf, they discovered a waterproof case containing photographs and personal documents. The photographs showed a younger Dmitry Kozlov with a beautiful woman and a little girl with bright eyes and dark curls. The back of one photo was inscribed, "Elena and Natasha, Moscow, summer, 1982. "His family," Emma said softly, studying the little girl's face. Among the documents was a letter written in English, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Ben read it aloud. If you are reading this, I am likely dead, and my mission has failed. My name is Dmitry Kozlov, former attaché to the Soviet Embassy in Washington. I am not a traitor to my country, but I cannot serve a system that murders innocent people. I carry with me evidence of Soviet intelligence operations that threaten American security. More importantly, I have proof that American officials have been compromised by Soviet intelligence. This information could prevent a war, but only if it reaches the right people. I have hidden this evidence in 2 locations. The first is secured aboard this vessel. Both locations require specific knowledge to access, knowledge that I pray will find its way to people of honor. My daughter Elena is 7 years old. She believes her father is a hero. If something happens to me, please ensure that someone tells her the truth, that I died, trying to prevent innocent people from suffering. The treasure I leave behind is not gold or jewels. It is the truth. Use it wisely. Ben folded the letter carefully. The weight of Kozlov's sacrifice settled on the room like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about Cold War secrets anymore. It was about a father's final attempt to protect his daughter and his adopted country. "We have to find the vault," Emma said quietly. "He trusted someone to do the right thing." "It's not that simple," Ben replied. "People have been killed over this information. If we find it, then we make sure it gets to the right people," Jake interrupted, with the absolute certainty of childhood. "That's what heroes do." Marcus was studying the GPS coordinates again. "The underwater package will require specialized equipment to retrieve, but the ship's vault." He looked up at Ben. "That's here somewhere, waiting for us to find it." Ben thought about the black SUVs in the parking lot, the sense of being watched, the dangerous game they'd stumbled into. But he also thought about Kozlov's daughter, now in her 40s, never knowing the truth about her father's sacrifice. "We find the vault," he decided, "but we do it carefully, and if things get too dangerous, we run," Emma finished. "We know, Dad." But as Ben looked at his children, their faces bright with determination and purpose, he realized running might not be an option anymore. They were part of Kozlov's story now, guardians of secrets that could still change the world. The question was whether they were strong enough to carry that burden. They found Kozlov's personal effects box in the most obvious place, and the last place they'd thought to look. It was sitting in plain sight in the ship's safe, behind a door that Marcus had assumed was permanently locked. The brass key from the galley opened it easily. The box was made of stainless steel and sealed with rubber gaskets that had kept its contents dry for 4 decades. Inside, Ben found a treasure more valuable than gold, the intimate details of a man's life, carefully preserved for the daughter he'd never see again. There were more photographs, Elena, taking her first steps, blowing out birthday candles, sleeping peacefully with a stuffed bear. Letters from Natasha, written in Russian but accompanied by English translations in Kozlov's careful handwriting. And at the bottom, wrapped in silk, a confession that explained everything. Ben read the confession aloud, while Emma and Jake looked through the photographs. "My name is Dmitry Kozlov, and I am a traitor to no one but the corrupt system that spawned me. I write this knowing I may never see my beloved Elena again, but hoping that someday she will understand why her father had to choose between his family and his conscience. I was born in Stalingrad in 1945, in the ruins of a city that had seen too much death. My parents taught me that the Soviet Union represented hope for humanity. For 38 years, I believed that lie. In 1982, I was stationed in Washington as a cultural attaché. My real job was to manage a network of American assets, politicians, military officers, and intelligence officials who had been compromised by Soviet intelligence. I told myself I was serving peace, preventing the war that would destroy both our nations. Then I learned about Operation Nightfall. My handler in Moscow explained the plan with the casual brutality that characterized Soviet leadership. America's compromised officials would be activated simultaneously to sabotage their own defense systems. The goal wasn't victory, it was mutual destruction disguised as American incompetence. Millions would die. Elena would grow up in a world poisoned by radiation and hatred, if she grew up at all. I could not be part of genocide, even genocide committed in the name of ideological purity. I made my choice. The documents I carry contain the names of every American asset in our network, along with evidence of their activities and payment records. More importantly, they contain the complete Operation Nightfall timeline and target list. This information could save lives, but only if it reaches people with the courage to act on it. I pray that whoever finds this will understand the weight of what I have sacrificed. Tell Elena that her father loved her more than life itself. Tell her that he died believing in the possibility of a better world. The vault containing the primary evidence is located in the ship's engine room, behind the auxiliary fuel tank. The access code is Elena's full name and birth date in Russian, Yelena Viktorovna Kozlova 4,051,976. May God forgive us all. Dmitry Kozlov, October 15, 1983. Ben finished reading and looked up to find Emma wiping tears from her eyes. Jake had found a photograph of Elena at a playground and was staring at it with the intense focus he usually reserved for his action figures. She was just a little kid, Jake said quietly. Like us. Marcus had been silent through the reading, but now he stood and walked to the small porthole overlooking the harbor. The engine room vault. I should have thought of that. You knew about it? Ben asked. Suspected. During the attack, I saw Kozlov heading toward the engine room with those sealed cases. I assumed he was trying to hide, but... Marcus turned back to them. He was securing his insurance policy. Ben thought about the access code, Elena's full name and birth date in Russian. Even 40 years later, Kozlov had trusted that a father's love would be the key to unlocking the truth. We need to get to that vault, Emma said, carefully placing the photographs back in their protective sleeves. And we need to understand what we're walking into, Ben added. Marcus, you said there were American officials working for the Soviets. After 40 years, some of those people might still be alive. Marcus nodded grimly. And they've spent decades building careers, accumulating power, making themselves untouchable. If Kozlov's evidence surfaces now, they'll do anything to stop it, Ben finished. As if responding to their conversation, Ben's phone rang. The number was blocked, but something compelled him to answer. Mr. Grady. The voice was cultured, elderly, with the precise diction of someone accustomed to authority. My name is David Sterling. I believe we need to talk. Ben put the phone on speaker so the others could hear. About what? About the ship you've acquired. About the historical artifacts you may have discovered. About the safety of your children. The threat was delivered with the casual politeness of a man ordering coffee, which made it infinitely more chilling than any shouted intimidation would have been. I don't know what you're talking about, Ben replied, though his hands were shaking. Mr. Grady, I'm 80 years old. I don't have time for games. 40 years ago, I was a CIA handler working with a Soviet defector named Dmitry Kozlov. That operation was classified at the highest levels, and it remains classified today. Marcus had gone pale at the mention of Sterling's name. He scribbled a quick note and showed it to Ben. He's the one who betrayed Kozlov. What do you want? Ben asked. A meeting. There are things you need to understand about what you've found, things that affect national security. Meet me tomorrow at noon, Federal Hill Park, near the monument. Come alone. And if I don't, then you'll discover that some secrets are too dangerous for civilians to possess. The line went dead. Ben stared at the phone, his mind racing. David Sterling, the man who had betrayed Kozlov to the Soviets, was still alive, still connected enough to track down Ben's personal phone number. He found us fast, Marcus observed. Too fast, Ben agreed. How would he even know we found anything? Emma had been examining the waterproof box more closely. Now she held up a small electronic device that had been hidden beneath the silk lining. Maybe because of this. The device was no bigger than a hearing aid, but it pulsed with a faint blue light. Marcus took it from Emma and examined it carefully. GPS tracker. Military grade, designed to activate when the container is opened. He looked up at Ben. The moment you opened this box, Sterling knew exactly where you were. Ben felt a chill that had nothing to do with the harbor breeze. They weren't just being watched, they were being tracked by technology. Kozlov had planted 40 years ago. The defector had anticipated that the wrong people might find his evidence first. It's a trap, Jake said with the clarity that sometimes came from 8-year-old logic. He wants Dad to come alone so he can hurt him. Not necessarily a trap, Marcus corrected, but definitely not a social call. Sterling has spent 40 years covering up his betrayal of Kozlov. If that evidence becomes public, his reputation, his legacy, maybe even his freedom, Ben finished. He has everything to lose. So, what do we do? Emma asked. Ben looked at his children, then at Marcus, then at the photographs of little Elena Kozlov scattered across the table. A 7-year-old girl whose father had died protecting secrets that could still matter 40 years later. We get to that vault, he decided. Tonight, before Sterling realizes we're not going to play by his rules. And then we find out what Dmitry Kozlov thought was worth dying for. As they prepared to venture into the ship's engine room, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The black SUVs in the parking lot, Sterling's polite threats, the weight of 4 decades of buried secrets, all of it was converging on this moment. But when he looked at Elena's photograph, Ben knew they had no choice. Some promises transcended time and death, and Kozlov had trusted them to keep his. The engine room was a cathedral of rust and shadow, lit only by the flashlights Ben and Marcus carried. Emma and Jake had wanted to come, but Ben had insisted they stay in the bridge where they could watch for trouble. The auxiliary fuel tank loomed before them like a sleeping giant, its surface covered in 40 years of maritime grime. There, Marcus pointed to a section of the tank where the metal was slightly different in color. That panel's been welded back into place. Ben ran his hands along the edges. The welding was professional but hurried, done by someone who knew their way around a torch but was working under pressure. How do we get through it without damaging whatever's inside? Carefully, Marcus pulled out a small cutting torch from his tool bag. I came prepared. As Marcus worked to cut through the weld, Ben noticed something that made his blood run cold. Small electronic devices, no bigger than coins, were attached to various surfaces throughout the engine room. The blue LED lights were barely visible in the shadows, but once he knew what to look for, he could see them everywhere. Marcus, stop cutting. What's wrong? Ben pointed to the nearest device. We're not alone down here. Marcus examined the electronic device with growing alarm. Surveillance equipment, high-end stuff, recently installed. He checked his watch. These weren't here when I did my initial sweep yesterday, which means someone's been on the ship while we slept. They found 12 devices total, strategically placed to monitor every possible approach to the vault. But what chilled Ben most was the realization that whoever planted them had known exactly where to look. They hadn't just been watching the ship, they'd been watching Ben's team discover Kozlov's clues. Sterling, Marcus said grimly. He's been tracking our progress from the beginning. Ben thought about the phone call, the casual way Sterling had mentioned meeting tomorrow. He wanted us to find the vault. This is all part of some larger plan. They climbed back to the bridge where Emma and Jake were maintaining their watch. The children had spread Kozlov's photographs across the chart table, studying them with the intensity of junior detectives. Dad, look at this, Emma said, holding up one of the photos. Elena's not alone in this picture. Ben examined the photograph more closely. It showed Elena at what appeared to be a birthday party, surrounded by other children and adults. But in the background, partially obscured by shadows, stood a man in a suit, watching the celebration. "The man in the background," Jake said, pointing to the figure. "He's in other pictures too." Emma spread out several more photographs. The same man appeared in at least 6 different images. Always in the background. Always watching. He was younger in the photos, maybe 40, with the build and bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Marcus took the photographs and studied them under a magnifying glass. His face went white. "That's David Sterling, 40 years younger, but it's definitely him." "He was watching Kozlov's family?" Ben asked. "More than that." Marcus set down the magnifying glass. "He was Elena's CIA protection detail. After Kozlov defected, Sterling was supposed to arrange for Elena and her grandmother to be extracted from Moscow. What happened? According to the official record, the extraction was compromised by Soviet security. Elena and her grandmother were arrested and disappeared into the Gulag system." Marcus's voice was heavy with old guilt. "We assumed they were dead." Emma had been studying another photograph while the adults talked. Now she held it up with excitement. "But look at this one. It's dated 1985, 2 years after the defection." The photograph showed Elena, now taller and older, standing beside an elderly woman in what appeared to be a modest apartment. On the back, someone had written in English, "Elena and Babushka, safe in new home." "They made it out," Ben breathed. "But how?" Marcus asked. "And why didn't Sterling report it?" Jake had found something else, a folded piece of paper tucked behind one of the photographs. Ben unfolded it carefully, revealing a handwritten note in English. "David, the girl and her grandmother are secure at the arranged location. Payment transferred as agreed. The Kozlov matter is now closed permanently. All evidence destroyed as requested. V." Ben read the note twice before its implications sank in. Sterling didn't just betray Kozlov to the Soviets. He was being paid by them. Marcus stared at the note in disbelief. Sterling was a double agent. He sold out Kozlov, pocketed Soviet money, and then reported Elena and her grandmother as dead to cover his tracks. "But they were alive," Emma added. "Someone else extracted them." "Kozlov must have arranged backup protection," Ben realized. He didn't trust Sterling completely. The pieces of a 40-year-old puzzle were falling into place. Kozlov had suspected betrayal from within the CIA. He'd hidden evidence not just of Soviet operations, but of American treachery. And he'd arranged for his family's protection through channels that bypassed official intelligence networks. Ben's phone rang again. Sterling's number. "Have you considered my offer, Mr. Grady?" "I'm considering a lot of things," Ben replied, putting the phone on speaker. "Then perhaps you'd be interested to know that your activities have attracted attention from other parties. The Russians are still very interested in certain Cold War secrets." "What Russians?" "The same organization that killed Dmitry Kozlov 40 years ago. They've been monitoring intelligence chatter, and your recent discoveries have made them curious." Ben felt the temperature in the room drop. "You're saying we're being hunted by Russian intelligence?" "I'm saying that some secrets are too dangerous to leave in civilian hands. Meet me tomorrow, and I'll explain how we can resolve this situation safely." "And if I don't?" "Then you'll discover that the Cold War never really ended, Mr. Grady. It just went underground." The line went dead. Ben stared at the phone, his mind racing. Sterling was playing multiple angles, threatening Ben with Russian agents, while positioning himself as the solution to a problem he'd helped create. "He's lying," Marcus said flatly. "Sterling's been covering his tracks for 4 decades. The last thing he wants is for Kozlov's evidence to surface." "But what if he's not lying about the Russians?" Emma asked quietly. Before anyone could answer, they heard the sound of engines starting in the harbor parking lot. Through the bridge windows, they watched the black SUVs pull away in formation, leaving the area completely. "That's not good," Marcus observed. "Why would they leave?" Ben asked. "Because they're not the ones we need to worry about anymore. As if to punctuate Marcus's words, new vehicles appeared in the distance, dark sedans moving with the precision of a military convoy. They parked in positions that would block any escape from the harbor. Ben gathered his children close, his mind racing through their limited options. The vault in the engine room contained evidence that could expose decades of treachery and betrayal. But getting to it now meant navigating between Sterling's manipulation and the possibility of foreign agents who had even less interest in keeping Ben's family alive. "We need to get off this ship," Ben decided. "And go where?" Marcus asked. "Sterling knows where you live, where your children go to school, and if there really are Russian agents involved." "Then we go public," Emma said suddenly. "We take everything to the newspapers, to the internet. Make it so public that nobody can cover it up anymore." Ben looked at his 12-year-old daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. She was right, but going public meant painting targets on their backs that would never disappear. "First, we get the evidence," he decided. "Then we figure out how to use it." As they prepared to return to the engine room, Ben realized that Sterling's phone call had accomplished exactly what it was intended to do. It had forced Ben to make a choice: trust the man who had betrayed Kozlov, or take the risk of exposing secrets that powerful people had killed to protect. But as Ben looked at the photographs of Elena Kozlov, a little girl whose father had died protecting the truth, he knew there was really no choice at all. Some promises were worth any risk to keep. The cutting torch's blue flame cast dancing shadows on the engine room walls as Marcus worked through the final inches of welded steel. Ben kept watch while Emma and Jake monitored the surveillance devices they'd found. The electronic bugs remained active, which meant someone was still listening to every sound they made. "Almost through," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the torch's hiss. The metal panel came free with a dull clang that seemed to echo through the entire ship. Behind it lay a cavity lined with stainless steel, a vault designed to survive fire, flood, or time itself. At its center sat a waterproof case no bigger than a briefcase, sealed with a digital lock that still displayed a faint green light after 40 years. Ben approached the lock carefully. The display showed a cursor waiting for input, and below it, Cyrillic characters that spelled out what Marcus translated as "Enter Access Code." "Yelena Viktorovna Kozlova 4,051,976, Ben typed, using the Roman alphabet to spell Elena's full Russian name and birth date. The lock's display flickered. For a moment, Ben thought he'd made an error. Then the green light turned blue, mechanical tumblers clicked into place, and the case opened with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. Inside, arranged with almost religious precision, lay the evidence that Dmitry Kozlov had died protecting. Photographs of documents, microfilm reels, computer disks, and handwritten notes filled every inch of space. But what caught Ben's attention first was a manila envelope marked in English. "For Elena, the truth about your father." Ben opened the envelope and found a letter written in both Russian and English, along with a collection of personal items: Elena's first tooth, a lock of her hair, drawings she'd made for her father. Kozlov had carried pieces of his daughter's childhood with him into exile, treasures more valuable than any state secret. The letter was addressed to Elena, but clearly written for whoever might find it. "My beloved daughter, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally found its way to light. Your father was not a traitor. He was a man who chose love over loyalty, family over ideology, truth over convenience." The documents in this case contain evidence of Operation Nightfall, a Soviet plan to use compromised American officials to trigger a nuclear exchange. The plan was scheduled for implementation in March 1984. Your father prevented this by exposing the network, saving millions of lives, including yours. Among the compromised Americans was a CIA officer named David Sterling. He has spent 40 years building a career on the foundation of treachery, using Soviet money to purchase influence and position. He will do anything to prevent this evidence from becoming public. But there is something else you must know, Elena. You are alive. Despite what official records claim, your grandmother successfully extracted you from Moscow with help from honorable people in both governments. You have been living under a new identity, protected by those who understood that some secrets were worth keeping. Your father's final wish was that you live free from the shadows of his choices. But he also hoped that someday, when you were old enough to understand, you would know the truth about what he sacrificed for love. The evidence in this case belongs to history. What you do with it belongs to you. Ben looked up to find Emma and Jake reading over his shoulders, their faces solemn with the weight of Kozlov's story. 40 years later, a father's love still reached across time to protect his daughter. She's still alive, Emma whispered. Elena's alive somewhere. Marcus was examining the rest of the case's contents. Financial records, communication intercepts, photographs of meetings between Sterling and Soviet handlers. This is enough to destroy careers and rewrite Cold War history. And enough to get us killed, Ben added grimly. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the deck above, multiple people moving with military precision. Ben counted at least 6 different sets of boots, all converging on the ship's superstructure. "They're here," Jake whispered unnecessarily. Ben quickly gathered the most critical documents from the case, while Marcus pocketed the microfilm reels. They couldn't carry everything, but they could preserve the essential evidence. "The service tunnel," Marcus said, pointing to a narrow passage that led from the engine room to the ship's hull. "It exits near the waterline. If we can reach it." They heard voices, now American accents mixed with something else, commands given in English and another language Ben didn't recognize. Sterling had brought reinforcements, and they weren't all domestic. Moving as quietly as possible, Ben led his children through the service tunnel, while Marcus brought up the rear. The passage was barely wide enough for an adult, lined with pipes and cables that caught at their clothes and equipment. Behind them, they heard the engine room door being forced open. Flashlight beams swept through the space they'd just vacated, and angry voices echoed off the metal walls. "The vault's been opened," someone called in accented English. "Search everything," came Sterling's voice, calm and authoritative. "They can't have gone far." The tunnel exit led to a maintenance hatch just above the waterline. Ben helped Emma and Jake through first, then squeezed out himself. They found themselves on a narrow ledge that ran along the ship's hull, hidden from view by the dock's pilings. Marcus emerged last, carrying the waterproof case. "We need transportation," he whispered. "My truck is in the far parking lot, but they'll have it covered." Ben thought quickly. The harbor was surrounded by roads that would be easy to block, but there was another option. The water. "Do you still have diving gear?" "Not enough for all of us. I don't need diving gear. I need a way to get my kids to safety while you preserve that evidence." Emma tugged at Ben's sleeve. "Dad, look." She was pointing toward the harbor entrance, where a small Coast Guard patrol boat was making its routine evening rounds. The boat was still several hundred yards away, but it represented something Sterling couldn't control: federal authority outside his influence. "If we can signal them," Ben began. "Sterling will claim national security," Marcus interrupted. "He's still CIA, probably still has credentials that would make the Coast Guard back off. Not if we give them something he can't dismiss." Ben pulled out his phone and began typing a message to Ruth Martinez at the library. "Ruth has media contacts. If this story hits the news before Sterling can contain it." His phone buzzed with an incoming call. Ruth's number. "Ben, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours." Ruth's voice was tight with urgency. "I found Elena Kozlov." Ben's heart stopped. "You found her?" "She's been living in Baltimore for 30 years under the name Elena Victor. She works as a translator for the State Department, specializes in Russian documents." "Ben, she's been looking for information about her father her entire adult life." The implications hit Ben like a physical blow. Elena Kozlov was alive, living in the same city where her father had died, working for the same government that had buried his sacrifice. "Ruth, I need you to do something for me. Contact Elena Victor." Tell her that her father's evidence has been found. Tell her that David Sterling killed him for Soviet money. And tell her that we have proof. Ben, what's happening? You sound... Just do it, Ruth, and make sure the story gets out, no matter what happens to us. Ben ended the call and looked at his children. They were scared but determined, trusting him to find a way through the maze of danger and deception they'd stumbled into. From somewhere on the ship above, they heard Sterling's voice issuing orders. The search was expanding, and it was only a matter of time before their hiding place was discovered. But Ben had one more card to play. He pulled up his phone's camera and began recording. My name is Ben Grady, and I'm hiding on a ship in Baltimore Harbor with my 2 children. We've discovered evidence that CIA officer David Sterling betrayed a Soviet defector named Dmitry Kozlov in 1983. Sterling was paid by Soviet intelligence to expose Operation Nightfall, a plot that could have triggered nuclear war. Kozlov died protecting evidence of American officials working for the Soviets, including Sterling himself. He passed the phone to Emma, who continued the recording with the poise of someone twice her age. We're uploading this evidence to multiple news sources. If anything happens to our family, David Sterling is responsible. Jake took the phone next. Elena Kozlov, if you're watching this, your dad was a hero. He saved millions of people, and he never stopped loving you. Ben sent the video to Ruth, along with photos of the most damaging documents from Kozlov's case. Within minutes, the evidence would be beyond Sterling's ability to suppress. The Coast Guard patrol boat was close enough now that Ben could see the crew on deck. He helped Emma climb higher on the hull where she could be seen from the water, while Jake waved one of Marcus's emergency flares. The patrol boat's searchlight swung toward them, and Ben felt the first spark of hope he'd experienced in hours. Sterling might have influence, but he couldn't make a Coast Guard rescue disappear in front of witnesses. As the patrol boat changed course toward them, Ben heard Sterling's voice from the ship's deck above. Federal agents, stand down immediately. But the Coast Guard crew had already seen the children, and no amount of credentials would make them abandon a family in distress. The final confrontation was about to begin, and for the first time since finding Kozlov's secrets, Ben believed they might actually survive to see justice done. The Coast Guard patrol boat's searchlight illuminated the side of the Avalon Dawn like a theatrical spotlight, turning the rusted hull into a stage for the final act of Kozlov's 40-year-old drama. Ben helped Emma and Jake aboard the rescue vessel, while Marcus carefully transferred the waterproof case to the Coast Guard crew. "Sir, we received reports of a family in distress," the boat's captain said, a young woman whose nameplate read, Lieutenant Morrison. "Are you injured?" Before Ben could answer, David Sterling appeared on the ship's deck above them. Even in the harsh glare of the searchlight, he cut an impressive figure, tall, silver-haired, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that somehow looked elegant despite the maritime setting. "Lieutenant, I'm David Sterling, CIA Operations." He held up credentials that caught the light. "These individuals are in possession of classified materials vital to national security. I need them transferred to federal custody immediately." Lieutenant Morrison studied the credentials, then looked at Ben and his children. "Sir, I'll need to verify your identity and jurisdiction before—" "There's no time for bureaucratic protocol," Sterling interrupted. "Russian intelligence agents are en route to this location. These civilians are in immediate danger." Ben saw the doubt flickering in the lieutenant's eyes. Sterling's credentials looked authentic, his authority seemed unquestionable, and his concern for their safety appeared genuine. It was a masterful performance by a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of deception. "Lieutenant," Ben said quietly, "before you make any decisions, I think you should know that Mr. Sterling has been trying to suppress evidence of his own criminal activities." Sterling's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of anger that revealed the predator beneath the polished surface. "Mr. Grady is suffering from delusions brought on by stress and fear. The materials he's found have no bearing on current operations. Then you won't mind if we examine them." came a new voice from the harbor. A second boat approached from the darkness, a larger Coast Guard cutter whose deck bristled with armed crew members. At the bow stood a woman in civilian clothes, her dark hair pulled back severely, her eyes fixed on Sterling with the intensity of a laser sight. "Who are you?" Sterling demanded, his carefully maintained calm beginning to fray. "Elena Victor, State Department," the woman replied. "I believe you knew my father." The silence that followed was so complete that Ben could hear the gentle lapping of waves against the boat hulls. Sterling stared at Elena as if seeing a ghost, which in a very real sense he was. "That's impossible," Sterling whispered. "You died in Moscow 40 years ago. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Elena stepped from the cutter to the patrol boat with practiced ease. "Along with reports of my father's treachery, it seems." She was older now than her father had been when he died, a woman in her 40s, with Elena Kozlov's bright eyes and determined chin. But there was something else in her expression, something that spoke of decades spent searching for truth in a world built on lies. "I've spent my entire adult life working for the State Department, specializing in Russian intelligence analysis," Elena continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Imagine my surprise when I learned that a CIA officer named David Sterling had been making inquiries about my family for the past 40 years. Sterling's mask was completely gone now, replaced by the cold calculation of a cornered predator. Whatever you think you know, I know that you've been monitoring intelligence databases for any mention of Dmitry Kozlov or Operation Nightfall." Elena's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I know that you've used your position to suppress investigations and destroy evidence, and I know that you've been drawing a CIA pension funded partially by Soviet gold." Marcus opened the waterproof case and handed Elena a collection of documents. She examined them with the speed of someone trained to process complex information quickly. Financial records showing payments from Soviet intelligence to an American asset codenamed Patriot, she read aloud. Communication intercepts proving that Patriot provided intelligence on CIA defector operations, and photographic evidence of meetings between Patriot and his Soviet handlers. She looked up at Sterling. "The man in these photographs is 40 years younger, but it's definitely you." Sterling's hand moved toward his jacket, and Ben saw the telltale bulge of a concealed weapon. But Elena was faster, producing her own pistol with the fluid motion of someone who'd trained for this moment her entire life. "I wouldn't," she advised calmly. "The Coast Guard has very strict policies about weapons in federal waters." Lieutenant Morrison had been following the confrontation with growing alarm. "Ma'am, I'm going to need everyone to lower their weapons, and—" "Lieutenant, call your commanding officer," Elena interrupted, never taking her eyes off Sterling. "Tell him that Operation Nightfall evidence has been recovered and that we have a confirmed Soviet asset in custody." Ben watched Sterling's face as the reality of his situation sank in. For 40 years, he'd managed to stay ahead of the consequences of his betrayal. He'd built a career, accumulated wealth, and constructed a legacy, all founded on Dmitry Kozlov's blood. Now that foundation was crumbling beneath him. "The audio recording," Marcus said suddenly, producing a small device from the waterproof case. "Kozlov made a final recording before they killed him." Elena took the device with hands that trembled slightly, the first crack in her professional composure. "My father's voice? His final message," Marcus confirmed. "He wanted you to hear it if anything happened to him." Elena activated the device, and suddenly the harbor was filled with the voice of a man who'd been dead for 40 years. Dmitry Kozlov spoke in accented but precise English, his words carrying across the water like a message from beyond the grave. "My beloved Elena, if you are hearing this, then someone has found the courage to seek the truth. I am recording this on October 15, 1983, knowing that I may not live to see another sunrise. I want you to know that everything I did for love. Love of you, love of your mother, love of the innocent people who would die if Operation Nightfall succeeded. I betrayed no one, except those who betrayed humanity itself. The man responsible for my death is CIA officer David Sterling. He was paid by Soviet intelligence to expose our operation and ensure that Operation Nightfall would proceed. Sterling will tell the world that I was a traitor, but the evidence in this case proves that he is the true traitor. Elena, my beautiful daughter, I pray that you have grown up strong and free, unburdened by the shadows of your father's choices. But if you are listening to this, then perhaps the time has come for the truth to finally emerge. I love you beyond words, beyond time, beyond death itself. Remember that your father died believing in the possibility of a better world. The recording ended, leaving the harbor in profound silence. Elena stood motionless, tears streaming down her face as she heard her father's voice for the first time in 40 years. Sterling used her moment of vulnerability to make his move, lunging toward the edge of the patrol boat. But Ben was ready for him. 40 years of construction work had left Ben with quick reflexes and strong hands, and he tackled Sterling before the older man could reach the water. They struggled briefly on the deck of the patrol boat, but Sterling was 80 years old, and Ben was desperate to protect his children. The fight ended quickly with Sterling pinned beneath Ben's weight, his perfectly tailored suit torn and his silver hair disheveled. "It's over," Ben said quietly. Kozlov won. As the Coast Guard crew secured Sterling in restraints, Elena carefully placed her father's recording back in its protective case. The evidence that had cost Dmitry Kozlov his life was finally in the hands of someone who could ensure it reached the light of day. But even as Ben held his children close and watched Sterling being led away, he knew that the real victory belonged to a father who had loved his daughter enough to sacrifice everything for truth. The Coast Guard cutter's communications array crackled to life as Elena placed calls that would reshape 40 years of Cold War history. Ben watched her work with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly how power moved through Washington's corridors, who had spent decades positioning herself for this moment. "This is Elena Victor, State Department Intelligence Division. I need a secure line to the Director of National Intelligence. Authorization code Tango 77 Alpha." She paused, listening to the response. "Tell him we have recovered Operation Nightfall materials and confirmed the identity of Soviet asset Patriot." Sterling sat in Coast Guard restraints, his face a mask of resignation mixed with calculation. Even captured, he was clearly evaluating his options, considering which levers of influence he might still be able to pull. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he said to Ben, his voice carrying the quiet menace of someone accustomed to being feared. Operation Nightfall was 40 years ago. The people involved are dead, the governments have changed, the world has moved on. "But you're still alive," Emma said with the devastating logic of childhood. "And you still took money to help bad people." Sterling's gaze shifted to Elena, who was coordinating with federal agencies through multiple encrypted channels. "You think you understand what your father was, but you don't. He was a fanatic who would have destabilized the entire Cold War balance. I prevented a catastrophe by taking Soviet gold and arranging his murder." Marcus had been silent through the confrontation, but now his Navy training showed in the controlled anger of his voice. "I was there, Sterling. I saw what you did. You saw what was necessary to prevent global nuclear war," Sterling replied. "Kozlov's evidence would have triggered a massive purge of intelligence assets on both sides. The resulting chaos could have led to miscalculation, accident, actual war." Elena finished her calls and turned back to Sterling. "Interesting theory. Would you like to hear what actually happened after my father's death?" She opened a tablet and began reading from classified files she'd clearly been authorized to access. Operation Nightfall was scheduled for March 15, 1984. Without my father's warning, it proceeded exactly as the Soviets planned. 12 compromised American officials activated their contingency protocols simultaneously. Ben felt a chill run down his spine. What happened? NORAD detected multiple anomalous signals from defense installations across the country. For 17 minutes, American nuclear forces believed they were under coordinated attack. Launch authorization codes were actually entered into 2 missile silos before human operators realized the readings were false. Elena's voice remained clinical, but Ben could hear the emotion underneath. We came within 17 minutes of nuclear war because David Sterling chose Soviet money over his country's survival. That's impossible, Sterling protested. If Nightfall had been implemented, I would have known. You were arrested by Soviet intelligence 3 days after my father's death, Elena replied calmly. Apparently they decided you were too much of a liability to keep operational. You spent 18 months in a Moscow prison before being released in a prisoner exchange. Ben saw Sterling's composure crack completely. How do you know that? Because I've had access to both American and Russian intelligence files on Operation Nightfall for the past 5 years. The State Department has been investigating Cold War-era security breaches, and your name kept appearing in classified documents. Elena's smile was cold as winter steel. We've been building a case against you for years. We just needed proof. Marcus was studying Sterling with the focused attention of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew. You said the Soviets killed Kozlov, but if they arrested you 3 days later, they killed him to tie up loose ends, Elena finished. My father was already dead by the time they decided Sterling was a liability, but they kept him alive because he still had value as a potential asset. Lieutenant Morrison had been coordinating with her superiors throughout the confrontation. Now she approached Elena with a confused expression. Ma'am, I'm getting contradictory orders. CIA wants Mr. Sterling transferred to their custody, but FBI is claiming jurisdiction. Neither, Elena replied. Mr. Sterling will be transferred to the Justice Department's National Security Division. This case involves treason spanning multiple decades and agencies. She turned back to Sterling, who was staring at his restraints as if seeing them for the first time. You spent 40 years thinking you'd gotten away with it. Building a career, accumulating wealth, convincing yourself that you were a patriot who'd made difficult choices for the greater good. I prevented nuclear war, Sterling insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Elena said quietly. My father prevented nuclear war by sacrificing his life to warn America about Operation Nightfall. You just delayed the reckoning. Ben pulled Emma and Jake closer as federal boats began arriving from multiple directions. The harbor was quickly filling with vessels carrying representatives from agencies he'd never heard of, all converging on the evidence that Dmitry Kozlov had hidden 40 years ago. What happens now? Ben asked Elena. Now we do what my father always intended, she replied. We make the truth public. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence that Sterling thought he'd buried forever. She looked at Ben's children with something approaching wonder. Your family found what intelligence agencies couldn't locate for 4 decades. You gave my father justice, and you gave me the truth about what happened to him. Jake tugged at Elena's sleeve. Are you going to be okay? Your dad loved you a lot. Elena knelt down to Jake's level, her professional composure finally giving way to genuine emotion. I'm going to be fine, sweetheart. And thanks to all of you, the whole world is going to know that my father was a hero. As Sterling was transferred to a federal custody boat, he looked back at Ben one final time. You have no idea what you've unleashed. There are secrets buried with Operation Nightfall that will destroy more than just my reputation. Then maybe it's time for them to be destroyed, Ben replied. The last Ben saw of David Sterling, he was a diminished figure sitting in the stern of a federal boat, finally heading toward the reckoning he'd avoided for 40 years. The man who had betrayed Dmitry Kozlov and nearly caused nuclear war was going to spend whatever remained of his life answering for his crimes. As the harbor began to clear of official vessels, Elena remained on the Coast Guard cutter with Ben's family. She was still holding her father's recording device, still processing the sound of a voice she'd thought she'd never hear again. He would have been proud of you, Ben told her. Everything you've accomplished, the person you've become, he would have been so proud." Elena smiled through her tears. "I spent my whole life wondering if he really loved me, or if I was just another asset he had to protect. Hearing his voice, knowing that everything he did was for love. That's what parents do," Emma said simply. "We love our kids more than anything else in the world." Elena looked at Emma, then at Ben, understanding passing between them. They were both children who had lost parents, both people who had learned that love transcended death and time and the complicated politics of nations. The evidence was secure, Sterling was in custody, and 40 years of lies were finally giving way to truth. But the real victory belonged to a father's love and the belief that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. 6 months later, Ben stood on the deck of the Avalon Dawn and marveled at how much could change when the truth finally found its way to light. The ship looked nothing like the rusted derelict he'd claimed from Baltimore harbor. Fresh paint gleamed in the morning sun, her superstructure had been restored to its original glory, and a steady stream of visitors crossed the gangway to explore what had become the most famous vessel in maritime history. The bronze plaque beside the main entrance told the story in simple words. The Avalon Dawn Memorial dedicated to Dmitry Kozlov, and all those who choose truth over convenience, love over loyalty, and hope over fear. Emma emerged from the ship's museum, leading a group of schoolchildren through exhibits that explained Cold War history through the lens of one man's courage. At 13, she had grown into the role of junior docent with the confidence of someone who had seen history made firsthand. And this is where we found the captain's log. She was explaining to the fascinated children. "My dad was just trying to strip paint, but sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you're not really looking for them." Jake appeared at Ben's side, carrying a model of the ship he'd been working on all morning. At 9, he had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of maritime history and could explain the Avalon Dawn's restoration in technical detail that impressed even professional shipbuilders. "Dad, Elena's here," Jake announced. "She brought someone with her." Ben looked toward the gangway and saw Elena Victor approaching with an elderly woman whose eyes held the same intelligent spark as her granddaughter's. Natasha Kozlova was 87 years old, but she moved with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime surviving impossible circumstances. "Ben," Elena called, embracing him with the warmth of family. "I want you to meet my grandmother, Babushka. This is the man I told you about." Natasha studied Ben with eyes that had seen revolution, war, love, and loss. When she spoke, her English carried the musical accent of her homeland. "You are the one who found my son-in-law's truth." "Your granddaughter did that," Ben replied. "I just stumbled onto the right ship." "No stumbling," Natasha said firmly. "Dmitry always said that important things find their way to the right people at the right time. You were meant to find his story." They walked together through the ship's museum, past displays of declassified documents and Cold War artifacts. The centerpiece was Kozlov's recording, playing on a continuous loop for visitors who wanted to hear the voice of a man who had changed history through love. "The book comes out next month," Elena told Ben, as they reached the bridge where everything had begun. "The publisher thinks it will be a bestseller." Elena had spent the past 6 months writing The Kozlov Files, a comprehensive account of her father's sacrifice and Sterling's betrayal. The book would reveal details about Operation Nightfall that had remained classified for 40 years, finally giving the world the complete story of how close civilization had come to nuclear war. "What about Sterling?" Ben asked. 25 to life, federal prison. He'll die behind bars." Elena's satisfaction was evident, but not vindictive. The Justice Department found evidence of 12 other operations he compromised for Soviet money. He was responsible for the deaths of at least 6 American intelligence officers. Marcus appeared from the engine room, where he'd been working on the ship's restoration. At 73, he had found new purpose in preserving the vessel that had shaped his life 4 decades earlier. "The vault's ready for the ceremony," he announced. exactly as Dmitri left it, except now visitors can see what he died protecting. Tomorrow would mark the first anniversary of the Avalon Dawn's transformation from abandoned derelict to memorial. The ceremony would be attended by intelligence officials from multiple nations, all coming to pay respects to a man whose courage had prevented global catastrophe. But tonight belonged to family. Ben gathered Emma and Jake on the ship's bow as the sun set over Baltimore harbor. The same water that had carried Dmitry Kozlov to his death now reflected the lights of a city that had embraced his memory. The Avalon Dawn had become more than a museum. She was a symbol of hope, proof that broken things could be restored and hidden truths could find their way to light. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found the ship?" Emma asked, leaning against the rail where Kozlov had once stood. "I think we would have found something else," Ben replied. "Not the ship, maybe, but some other way to move forward. That's what people do when they need hope. They find it in unexpected places." Jake held up his model ship, comparing it to the real vessel around them. "I like our story better than the treasure stories in books." "Why's that?" Ben asked. "Because we didn't keep the treasure for ourselves. We shared it with everyone." Ben smiled, thinking about the foundation they'd established with the reward money from the government. The Kozlov Foundation provided scholarships for refugee children, supporting the education of young people whose families had fled persecution, just as Elena's had 40 years ago. Elena and Natasha joined them at the bow, 3 generations of women connected by love and loss and the long journey toward truth. Natasha pulled out a small photograph, the same image of 7-year-old Elena that her father had carried into exile. "He never stopped believing he would see you again," Natasha told Elena. "Even at the end, even when he knew they were coming for him, he believed that love was stronger than death." As the harbor lights reflected off the water and the city settled into evening quiet, Ben thought about the strange journey that had brought them all together. He'd claimed an abandoned ship hoping to find scrap metal, and instead, he'd found a story that proved some things were too important to remain buried. Sarah's wedding ring was still in his pocket, but it no longer felt like a weight pulling him backward. Now, it felt like a reminder that love endured, that the choices people made for their families echoed across time and touched lives they would never know. The Avalon Dawn had given Ben and his children purpose, but more than that, she had given them proof that broken things could be made whole again. Sometimes the most valuable treasures weren't gold or jewels, they were truth and justice, and the knowledge that someone had cared enough to fight for what was right. As they prepared to leave the ship for the evening, Ben took one last look at the memorial plaque. Dmitry Kozlov's name was engraved in bronze that would outlast all of them, a permanent reminder that ordinary people could change the world through extraordinary love. The Avalon Dawn had kept her secrets for 40 years, waiting for the right family to find them. Now she would keep new memories, the laughter of children learning about courage, the tears of visitors who understood sacrifice, and the quiet satisfaction of truth finally finding its way home. Some ships were built to carry cargo, others were built to carry dreams. The Avalon Dawn had been built to carry both, and in the end, she had delivered exactly what the world needed most: hope wrapped in the certainty that love really was stronger than death.